High inside the Ghirlandina Tower in the heart of Modena, protected behind a pane of glass, sits a single weathered wooden bucket. It is an unremarkable object by any standard, composed of simple oak staves and bound by rusting iron hoops that have long since lost their luster. Yet this humble vessel remains one of the most significant artifacts in Italian history, serving as a silent witness to a conflict that saw thousands of men march to their deaths under the scorching sun of 1325. While the story is often told as a comical anecdote about a petty theft, the reality of the situation was far darker and more complex than a simple raid on a public well. To understand why a bucket sits in a bell tower today, one must first understand the volatile landscape of medieval Italy, where the line between a prank and an act of war was thin enough to be erased by a single night of drinking. The tension between the cities of Modena and Bologna did not begin with a well, but with a divide that split the very soul of Europe. During the 14th century, Italy was a patchwork of warring city-states, each forced to choose a side in a cosmic struggle for power between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Those who supported the Pope were known as Guelphs, while those who stood with the Emperor were called Ghibellines. Bologna was a staunch Guelph stronghold, a city of scholars and priests, while its neighbor Modena was fiercely Ghibelline, aligned with the iron-fisted authority of the emperor. This was not merely a political disagreement, but a fundamental difference in identity that dictated where a person could trade, whom they could marry, and which prayers they could utter. By the year 1325, the two cities had been provoking each other for decades, turning their shared border into a graveyard of minor skirmishes and cattle raids. The air in the region was thick with the scent of burning crops and the constant sound of church bells warning of approaching riders. It was in this atmosphere of heightened paranoia that a small group of Modenese soldiers decided to strike a blow against the pride of Bologna. They did not aim for the city's treasury or its famous university, as they knew that such a direct assault would be met with overwhelming force. Instead, they chose to target the most basic necessity of life, located just outside the city gates. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Modenese raiders bypassed the main fortifications and reached a public well located at the Porta San Felice. Their goal was not to poison the water or destroy the source, but to commit an act of symbolic desecration that would echo through the halls of the Bolognese government. They seized the wooden bucket used to draw water and retreated into the darkness, carrying the stolen prize back to Modena like a captured king. When the sun rose over Bologna the next morning, the missing bucket became the catalyst for an explosion of rage that had been simmering for generations. To a modern observer, the loss of a bucket seems like a trivial inconvenience that could be solved by a trip to a local carpenter. However, in the hyper-competitive world of the Italian Renaissance, symbols were often more valuable than gold. By stealing the bucket, the Modenese were telling the Bolognese that they were unable to protect even their most basic communal property. It was a calculated insult designed to force a confrontation, and the Bolognese leadership took the bait with terrifying speed. They did not ask for a replacement or demand financial compensation, but instead mobilized the largest army the region had seen in years. The scale of the response was staggering compared to the nature of the crime. Bologna called upon its Guelph allies, assembling an infantry force of 30,000 men and 2,000 heavily armored cavalry. This was a professional army equipped with the finest steel and siege engines of the era, all marching toward the Modenese border to reclaim a few pounds of wood and iron. The Modenese, realizing they had provoked a sleeping giant, could only muster 7,000 soldiers to meet the threat. On paper, the coming battle should have been a massacre that ended with the total destruction of Modena. The two forces met at the town of Zappolino as the light of the short November day began to fade. The Bolognese generals were confident in their numerical superiority, expecting the Modenese lines to crumble under the first charge of their heavy horse. Yet, as the trumpets sounded and the infantry moved into position, a strange phenomenon began to unfold on the battlefield. The Modenese soldiers, knowing they had no hope of survival in a traditional fight, fought with the frantic energy of men who had nothing left to lose. They utilized the darkening terrain to create confusion, turning the larger size of the Bolognese army into a liability as units began to collide with one another in the gloom. The Battle of Zappolino lasted only a few hours, but it resulted in one of the most stunning upsets in military history. The Bolognese ranks broke under a series of concentrated Modenese charges, and the superior force was sent into a chaotic retreat back toward their own city walls. The Modenese did not stop at the border, but pursued the fleeing army all the way to the gates of Bologna. They spent the next few days taunting the citizens from just outside the fortifications, holding a mock athletic competition to further humiliate their rivals while the stolen bucket was paraded in front of the walls. The war eventually ended with a treaty, but the bucket was never returned to its original home. Instead, it was taken to the Cathedral of Modena and later moved to the tower where it remains to this day. While the thousands of men who died at Zappolino have been largely forgotten by time, the object they fought over has become immortal. The bucket ceased to be a tool for drawing water and became a vessel for the collective pride of an entire city. It represents a moment when the abstract concepts of honor and humiliation became more real to people than the physical reality of life and death. This history reveals a peculiar trait of human psychology that still dictates much of our modern world. We often believe that wars are fought over resources, land, or ideology, but the war of the bucket suggests that the most dangerous spark is often the perception of disrespect. The bucket was a placeholder for an ancient grudge, a tangible way for a population to express a hatred that was too large to be contained in words. By focusing on a trivial object, both sides were able to justify a level of violence that would have seemed irrational under any other circumstances. The Ghirlandina Tower is not just a museum for a piece of medieval wood, but a monument to the power of narrative. The bucket is a reminder that any object can become a weapon if enough people decide that it represents their dignity. When visitors stand before the glass case today, they are not looking at a relic of a simpler time, but at a warning about the fragility of peace. It proves that the distance between a peaceful morning at a well and a bloody afternoon on a battlefield is often only as wide as the human ego. Looking at the bucket through the lens of the 21st century, it is easy to mock the men of 1325 for their perceived pettiness. However, the same patterns of symbolic escalation and identity-based conflict continue to shape our global politics and personal lives. We still find ourselves willing to sacrifice everything for symbols that hold no inherent value, simply because our rivals have told us they matter. The story of the War of the Bucket is ultimately a mirror, showing us that while our technology and weapons have changed, the fundamental triggers of human conflict have remained exactly the same for nearly 700 years.